So hi everybody, this is T. Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to begin our exploration of finding joy. Where does happiness actually live on the change grid? So I have chatted over to all of you on the call right now the adjective map handout. It should appear, oh, I see why it hasn't. I sent it to host and panelists. I need to send it to everybody. So we'll do that one more time. But anyway, now that more of you are on the call, you're going to be receiving a document that you can download. It's a PDF file. It's quite large, but this is the adjective map handout. Sooner or later in our discussion about where does happiness live on the change grid, we're going to need to take a look at the adjective map to see what pointers it's going to give us. So now, before we get into that, I want to share with you another layer that someone thought I should put on the change grid. And this has to do about whether someone is taking the offense or the defense and whether they are active or passive. And I thought this was pretty straightforward. So it's going to be a good review of what you guys are looking at on the screen. So if you guys remember back to your training in ChangeWorks, there's a section that we do on a comparative human typological analysis. And in this section, what we do is take all these different models of human behavior that have been proposed by everybody and their brother over the course of decades and centuries, and try to figure out how they overlap, how they relate to one another. And because we believe they're all trying to describe the exact same thing, which is how a human being operates, we know that these models should resonate with one another. And so by comparing them and contrasting them, we are able to overlay them in a way that they can reinforce one another. They can fill in the gaps that each and every one of them has their own blind spots or their own gaps. But by integrating them, we can minimize what those gaps are. And ultimately, we can end up with a tool that we believe gives people a rather comprehensive map of how people operate. And that then gave rise to this thing we call the comprehensive adjective map. So we'll talk about that in grand detail as we get closer and closer to. But I thought, all right, well, it all starts by looking at these four quadrants on which the majority of the models we've integrated tend to overlay. The majority of models of human behavior tend to want to divide humanity into four groups. And they use different identifiers. We just use our cardinal directions: outgrid, upgrid, ingrid, and downgrid. And so just as a way of giving my gifted students a little bit of a quiz, if I said two of these quadrants are where people are more likely to take the offense and two are more likely to take the defense, which two do you think are more likely to defend versus take the more offensive, aggressive kind of stand? Who are my defenders and who are my
ingrid and downgrid?
Ingrid and downgrid. Well, I agree with ingrid. I agree with
and upgrade.
Ingrid and upgrade. Now, why would we think that ingrid and upgrade would both be more likely to be defending themselves? Thoughts about that?
Low ability.
Low ability. And so they don't have enough, know enough to take the more aggressive kind of approach, take the offensive kind of approach. But one of those are going to be very active in their defensive efforts, and one's going to be more passive in their defensive efforts. Who's more likely to be active?
Upgrade.
Upgrade, because we know they're a real threat is coming to them. And so low ability, high challenge, I could be very much in harm's way. And although I don't have all the ability I like to have, I may have no choice but to take whatever ability I do have and actively put it into place to help me out of whatever that dangerous situation can be. The person who is in grid is more likely to be passive around it. And mostly it's because the threat level is much lower. So perceived challenge is 6 or lower. And so they can be a little bit more passive. But if you guys will remember, we also find that if you're in the in-grid danger zone, passive aggressive behavior could also occur. So We'll talk about that in a second. Now, the people that are taking the offense then would be the outgrid person and the downgrid person. But one of those is going to be very active in their offensive, maybe literally active in the offensive uh, position they're taking. And the other one is going to be more passively on the offense. So which one's more active? Which one's more passive?
Outgrid is active.
Outgrid.
Grid is active and downgrid is passive. So now let's kind of put those a little bit to the test of describing someone who's in that situation. I do think outgrid is the easiest one to understand and embrace. These are people who believe they have a very high ability to accomplish whatever it is they set out to do. And they believe that what they're setting out to do is really quite challenging. It's not for the timid. So no doubt they have to be in that more, just a second. They have to be in that more outgrid kind of energy. So they are very much more likely to take the initiative, be the aggressor. Even if they aren't that far outgrid, this is still where people become more assertive, where they become more deliberate, more intentional. That those words in and of themselves imply a certain level of action is being taken in order to do something that has been, when I say decided upon, that's been calculated, that's been whatever. So active offense is definitely living outgrid. Thoughts about that?
Mhm.
Yeah, you agree with that? Okay, active offense.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So and again, anybody can unmute and throw in whatever you'd like to throw in. But now down.
The adjective map showed up in the chat.
Oh, yay. All right. So all y'all just kind of start clicking on that. It should be there for everyone. If
Massive.
Yeah, it is a very large thing. And when you see it, and I explain how it came to be, you'll know why it's bigger. I'm bringing this up because it's time for us to do our next wave of updating it.
Bigger so you can tape it to the wall.
Yeah, well, if you print it out, it's actually 3 feet by 3 feet in the main adjective map. So you could take it to someone who prints out blueprints or something like that and actually print it out. But we designed it more as a searchable PDF file for reasons we'll get into a bit later. Okay, so now downgrid is also on the offense, but they're passive. These are the people that are waiting to tell you they told you so. So these are the people who rate themselves as having very high level of ability, but they view themselves as being highly competent, fluent, even masterful of whatever it is that's going on down there. And so they don't feel like they need to be actively involved in attacking whatever needs to be attacked. They're just lying in the wait, ready to point out whatever your flaws are, whatever you've missed or whatever. So, and it's again, because they view the challenge as being much lower. Nevertheless, all of you probably know plenty of people who tend to be of the analytical variety. They do believe that they have wrapped their head around all kinds of things to a point of being at least conversant, if not fluent, if not achieving a level of mastery around it. And they tend to tell you so when the opportunity presents itself. So have you guys all met plenty of these downgrid, passively offensive sort of people? And I don't mean they're offending you. I'm talking about sports, offense and defense. Nevertheless, people in the outgrid danger zone are very offensive. So, and even people downgrid could actually be offensive. So, so we'll still leave that word as one to find on the adjective map. Where does someone who's offensive, where does that live on the change grid? Now, the people that are actively defensive, I think, are clearly upgrid. Some threat was waiting for them and off they go. And then the in-grid are more passive, no immediate threat, but nevertheless, this is where the victim tends to live on the change grid. And that victim reality, or that victim kind of perception of oneself kind of means you have to be defending yourself at all times. And the better you can defend yourself when there is no immediate threat, perhaps the better you can prevent a real threat from arising. And so, all right, so can you guys kind of see how this whole offense and defense kind of thing overlays on the change grid?
Yes.
Yep. Now, I did that purely as a way to just remind you where energies are on the change grid, because now we're going to start talking about the real point of today's call, and that's about finding joy. And so I have just come back from a 12-day cruise with Dr. Diane Bufflin. And for those of you who aren't aware of who she is, Diane is a clinical psychotherapist, but she specializes in biochemical psychology. So this whole understanding of the role that neurotransmitters and hormones apply in the decisions you make and the actions you take and the feelings that you have and the beliefs that you hold and all those sorts of things. So she's a very, very big believer, as I've shared with many of you before, that there's very little point in embarking upon talk therapy until someone's chemistry has been brought into balance. When you bring their chemistry into balance, it's amazing how many of their issues simply fall by the wayside. So thoughts about that before I go to the next little level of depth here? Yeah. All right. So I was showing Diane the adjective map, and we were talking about the kinds of things that happen. She had never seen the adjective map before. And so I was explaining about how it all came to be and why certain locations on the change grid kind of lead people to holding certain energies, resulting in certain behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, etc., and all that kind of stuff. And she kind of noticed something that she ultimately said is just affirming something about me. And she goes, do you know what makes me do what I do? I do it because it makes me happy. And so everything that I do, it's all about seeking happiness, finding joy in the moment. And that's one way I've always described Diane. It's kind of like, she is really all about filling her days with finding ways to bring other people happiness. And as a result of bringing them happiness, she feels very happy. So I said, well, what in my way of looking at it, she's just described what she does in order to achieve her dopamine fix. And so I said, you're addicted to dopamine just like everybody else. But luckily for the rest of the world, you don't get your dopamine by bringing misery to people or causing trouble or stirring up whatever it is. You get your dopamine reward by bringing happiness to others, by letting them have greater insights and understanding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, biochemically, what would drive someone to be on a continuous quest for achieving this state of happiness? So Brian, you're our resident expert on all things neurochemical. Am I right, wrong?
No, yeah, you're spot on. What I like about Diane particularly is this fact that she doesn't wait for it to happen. Because
Right.
remember, the brain is designed for status quo. And so it's designed in a way to preserve and conserve energy, which means that it's going to always rely on the past as the kind of de facto consciousness. And that's where people start from. So I remember in medical school, when we studied the neuroscience in the laboratory for the neuroscience of happiness and pleasure, there were like 3 buckets that we were looking at in terms of what makes that neurochemical soup, if you will.
Sure.
There was the motivation, there was the pleasure, and then there was the learning.
Tell me about the learning part.
So remember, we talked about acetylcholine, right? And how that creates like this spotlight. So when we talk about neuroplasticity, right, it builds in your sleep. And so when you do something with enough intensity, enough focus, the alertness is there. Even in your sleep, you're building that neural pathway. And that's the point of having passion behind what it is that you're doing. Not necessarily as the lead factor, but certainly as an important ingredient in what you're doing. Because passion can lead us astray, right?
Right.
So, some people can, be passionate about the things that they're addicted to that's actually causing harm.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So acetylcholine helps us to actually learn from it so that we can continue to grow and expand from it. And so that takes us out of the downgrade where it's like, hey, been there, bought that t-shirt, 900 times.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
No, I can still learn, I can still grow, and there's no age limit to that. And that kind of consciousness is always available. But if we're stuck in, the past, then we can't really access it in its fullest capacity.
Hmm. Hmm. Excellent. And so, as Diane and I were having this discussion, her observation was that nowhere in the change grid way of doing things is there an assessment of the happiness that something brings to you. And that is a motivation. And I said, well, it's because I think that happiness and all of its variables are variations are a result of where you are. So not a factor that takes you to someplace, but something that you experience when you get to someplace. And so I said, if anything, your quest for happiness is going to be revealed in your assessment of importance, because the more happiness it brings you, the more important you deem it to be. And she agreed with that. And I said, but not everyone on the planet uses happiness as their primary motivator. And so we got into a big discussion around this because, and I'm going to share something personal with you guys, is that I think I've shared with you before that my diagnosis from a mental health kind of perspective for all of my life has been that I have endogenous depression. I'm not depressed about anything. I'm just depressed. And so it's just part of who I am, how I've always operated. And so as Diane was talking about this whole idea about the quest for happiness, I had to say to her, I don't even know what that means. So I certainly have moments where I would say I found something pleasant, or I found something, made me laugh, or this was something that was, I don't know, I'm happy in the moment. But happiness as an enduring state, I have no concept of that at all. And that's when she brought up that my underlying diagnosis was anhedonia. So anhedonia really means an absence of pleasure. And I just don't relate to that sort of thing. So when she says, hey, do you want to go on one of the islands, or do you want to do this, or you don't want to do that? My answer is always, well, whatever. I don't feel happy, but I also don't feel unhappy. And while I don't feel pleasure, I don't feel displeasure either. And so I'm rather flat and neutral about the whole thing. Now, I happen to believe that it's because of my mental state that I've ended up developing change works and everything at it. It's like, I mean, I do my best to live at the center of the change grid because that seems to be my default location anyway. But Diane then observed that there is a very large absence of happiness related adjectives on the adjective map.
Oh,
Yes, and that should not be surprising, because if I don't process the world from that vantage point, then why would I be, queuing into happiness related words? And so that got us into a very long discussion. And I was with her all day, every day for 12 days. Is what does joy really mean? What is happiness? What are all the variables that come into play when we start talking about something about happiness? And I said, now that's a subject for the circle to be talking about.
mhm.
Okay, so all right, with that, anyone have any thoughts, comments about what I've shared with you? Endogenous depression, anhedonia, not able to relate to certain states, emotions, whatever. Anyone? Kathy, you've unmuted.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to. I always find it incredibly refreshing that you are always so candid about who you are and where you've been, and it really leads to a lot of not only wonderful discussion, but lots of learning and insight, at least for me. I think that, as you were stating it and talking about the notion of not having happiness related adjectives on the chart, I hadn't really thought about that, but I always felt that there was something missing and I didn't know what it was. So I love the idea of exploring this. This is really timely for me because I'm on a quest for joy myself. And a spiritual quest for joy, a lifelong quest for joy, because I have all kinds of ancestral issues that point away from it. So I am just delighted that we're having this, and I just want to say I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
I'm so glad, because I also think that people are on a quest for finding joy in an increasingly disturbed and disturbing world. That ability to find joy in the moment, I think, is going to be a very, very important, what I would say, coping mechanism at the very least.
Absolutely.
If we got to be able to find it. And interestingly enough, considering my situation, I find plenty of things that distract me, that I might even find amusing in the moment. But apparently that's not what happiness is. No, I'm also reminded, one of the key books that I explored early on in my kind of personal development was a book called The Philosophy of Value, and that's the one by the Japanese educator Sunya Saburo Makaguchi. And one of the very first things he says in that book is that the purpose of life is to create or to achieve objective, or rather subjective, happiness. That everyone is just on a quest to make themselves happy, to find wherever that happiness is. And then he talks about how being able to create value and trade that value with others is going to bring value to you, and that's going to open up feelings of pride and purpose, and that's going to make you happy. And so I think Diane is right when she says, her whole world is driven by this opportunity to make other people happy. So yeah, there, go ahead.
I think
Comments.
it's timely, though, for a number of reasons. Like you said, all the things that are going on today, but I'm minded of, in axiology, which is the formal name for value science.
Yes.
It talks about the whole idea of life, as you just described, is about adding value. The challenge of today, and part of it is because all that's going on and this instantized kind of mentality, is people want it in extremes. And we go to extremes to get it. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out, if you're taking on more stimulus than your capacity and ability to take it on, you're going to feel out of sorts. And so then that quest, becomes like this ultimate conquest that's an ultimate failure, because the way you've gone about it. The idea of value science, the value wing, if you will, isn't the end product, as it's equally as important what goes on in the process. Like how you achieve that value, that matters as much too.
Yeah, yep. And it's going to be different for different people under different circumstances.
Right.
And because of that, that tells me that it has to overlay on the change grid. And so that's what I want to really kind of get to with you guys. And I'm going to send you, now I'm going to send you a document. It says that it's an outline, but this is random thoughts that I had as I started thinking about this. So let me just kind of chat this over to everybody. It's a little Word document, but it has a couple, okay, you guys should have it already. I said it to everyone. That's called kindness. I attended a session yesterday and the group discussion topic was, what does being kind mean to you? Etymologically, it's from the old word kin. So it's a connection with others that makes them feel like kinfolk. That's
good.
very interesting. That's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I found
Yeah.
it fascinating.
Yeah. So that's again, I'd be curious to know, where does kindness live on the change grid? Because we know this, everything lives on the change grid, or my whole life's work has been nothing but phooey. So, but I imagine that we've spent enough time, enough years developing this that, I think we can fairly say it has merit. So, how much, that's debatable.
Uh, kindness is at, it's at 3344.
Yeah, it's on the map. I remember that one for sure. And I have lots of
Right.
other tools that come to the adjective, but I know several people on the call. For example, I think Boris is on the call, or was on the call. The adjective map is something that he may not have seen before, but I think for a lot of you, this is just going to be a bit of a review. Okay, so if you guys open up that Word document I sent over to you, I'm just going to slide it onto the screen for right now so you see a few little things. I'm very curious to know whether or not things like there are whole happiness hierarchies. If you do a Google search for the hierarchy of happiness, you're going to find all kinds of works that have been done around it, and different diagrams, all sorts of things are out there. But I'm curious to know whether or not things like Maslow's hierarchy and whether or not this hierarchy of happiness, are these radial trends on the change grid? Are they trends that tie to the level of tension someone's experiencing, to the level of drive they're experiencing, to a ratio of tension versus drive? How do these all come together? And so I'll slide that out of the way just to explain that radial trends are trends that originate at the center of the change grid and change as you go away in any direction. So if I said to you, is it possible that happiness is experienced by only one of these quadrants? Or does each of these quadrants have their own experience of happiness? So what would you guys say? Is it something that only one experiences, maybe two, or do all of them have their own expression of happiness?
I don't know what makes you happy. If you like being an asshole, the outgrid is a joy to play.
There you are. Okay. And so there you go.
And T, I think it's a matter of perspective, right? So wherever you may be in those four quadrants, in your own mind, you may feel a sense of happiness. So to others, it may appear that you're being a jerk, but in your mind, you don't see it that way.
Right. You're just being clear. You're being whatever. So
John Rickles. Think of John Rickles.
right, exactly.
He was in a state of joy insulting everybody.
Right. And he made a lot of money because of that.
And they were in a state of joy being insulted.
Well, exactly. It's, when I think about this whole idea about states of happiness, moments of happiness, again, versus happiness that endures. So I think happiness as a long-term state of existence is different than happiness in the moment, if you can. So for example, we've often talked about a good roller coaster should put you where on the change grid? If you're going to say that was a good roller coaster, where did it need to put you on the change grid?
I would say upgrid.
Upgrid. Why?
Because it's exciting.
It's exciting.
That the kind of stress that is exciting.
Exactly. And so although we know that a roller coaster has been very tightly engineered for safety, at least we hope, we assume it has been, and obviously there's occasional things that go wrong, but nevertheless, we know that it has simultaneously been engineered to make us feel as out of control as possible, putting us into situations that humans would not otherwise experience. And then we end up surviving it. So people are whooping and hollering and smiling and jumping up and down and laughing and when they get off of a good roller coaster. And so does happiness reside upgrid?
It can, but it goes to exactly what Shags and Tim think that was describing, because like the roller coaster scenario that you just described is done in the context of fun. And that makes it okay, right? To hit that temporary stress and that kind of excitement, but that's not something you will want to do all the time.
Well, right. And, let's go into other possibilities there, because I do believe that that upgrade energy is also where we're going to find a lot of thrill seeking behaviors. And so, yeah, we could certainly say, well, it's because they find those things fun. That's why they're doing them. So fun might very well be a variation on happiness. So one of the things that occurs when people are happy is that they have fun, or maybe fun is one of the things that brings people happiness. We could look at cause and effect, but I know that happiness can occur upgrid. But I wonder if you're one of these free divers or free climbers, do you think they describe what they're doing as being fun? Or is it something beyond fun where they are conquering their fears, where
Yeah,
they
that's
are,
building.
yeah, well, and that could be moving us into an outgrid kind of happiness. But nevertheless, I believe that there is a possibility for happiness upgrid. Are we all in agreement on that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have to ask about this. I think isn't happiness, or fun at least, but isn't happiness always contextual?
Absolutely. And that's the thing, because think about the neurochemistry behind all of this. When someone is up there, like in the roller coaster example,
Mhm.
you're creating a neurochemistry that's temporal at best. And so depending on your capacity to come down from that, that will determine if you even do it again at that level or that event in and of itself. And so happiness in and of itself have these kind of abstract, I guess you can say, attachments to them, and how people experience that is really what matters. So the context is really something quite important here as we have this conversation.
And so, and again, I do want to make sure we're talking about that, are exploring my thought that happiness as a state of being is different than happiness that is contextual in the moment or based on
Mhm.
whatever the situation happens to be. And I guess I'm bringing this up because when Diane is talking, she'll often say, that makes me happy, or I'm happy about it. And that would be more of the contextual kind of definition.
Right.
But I observe this woman behaving for wake up to go into sleep, and I can tell you she exists in a state of uninterrupted happiness.
Hmm.
So I gotta believe that's all based on her inherent neurochemistry.
Yeah.
And it's just, this is the bowl of soup she either was born with or she's developed, or whatever the case may be. But I see that there's also a possibility for sustained happiness. Now,
Yeah.
maybe that comes from a long habit of filling your life with situationally happy things, or and it just adds up and ultimately fills your day. But I do kind of feel there's those two possibilities there.
I tend
Yeah.
to see it too, like what you're describing for Diane. I think I tend to see it the same way that we look at medicine, like the different conditions and that people inherit or either they create shapes a baseline. And we're
Yeah.
looking at that baseline, right? The baseline helps us to determine things from that. And so we're looking at markers and those kinds of things, and then base a diagnosis on that baseline. And I think
Right.
Diane
Right.
probably has a higher baseline threshold than someone else, because so I was always told I'm Mr. Positive. That's always my thing. And it's a natural thing to me, but people think it's something like I work hard at doing, I guess.
Yes. Yes.
And I
Yes. Yes.
don't.
Yes.
I really don't.
Interesting. Yeah, because it's more of just an inherent kind of a thing. So I believe there is a nature and a nurture element to this whole happiness kind of equation, and I'd like to get into that in grand depth on another call. Maybe we'll get to that on Thursday. But I just want to finish this once around the change grid to say, is it possible that people that are out grid are also, Kathy, you unmuted. Did you want to throw something in?
Well, I do, and I don't want to just sort of move us off on another tangent, but the question that comes to mind, and we don't need to discuss it now, is happiness the same as joy? Because my understanding and my experience just through my spiritual work and people that I've talked to who really do bring joy to their lives, most of the time or almost all of the time, it is a state of mind, it's a state of being, and it is one that could be learned, but also could be inherent. But it allows one to look at the world from a place of love versus a place of criticism, or even but a place of love, which is a kind of it doesn't mean you're attached, but it means there's a detachment, but it's what is the word? But it is a sense of approaching the world as there are, this is a good place to be, and I can find those places. I can find where that is.
Yes.
If I live my life a certain way. So, I mean, that's an old way of talking about it. So I just wanted to raise that concept. We certainly don't need to discuss it now.
I think it's an absolutely great kind of concept, because I think it's going to ultimately lead us towards the discussion around radial happiness on the change grid. We'll get to that in just a second. Now, to Kathy's point about what about joy? Well, I sent you guys this Word document, and in it, there are 3 screen captures. So I just went to the thesaurus and I typed in a few little words for low-level happiness, which I consider to be pleasant. And look at the kind of words that they are saying are synonyms: cheerful, congenial, fun, lovely, polite, etc. You go a little bit further, you'll find the one for, I said, well, what are synonyms for happy? And here we got joyful and joyous and all those kinds of things: merry, overjoyed, thrilled, upbeat. And then the last one is, what are the synonyms for joyful? And then we get elated and festive and jubilant and all these kinds of things. You see, when we get to the adjective mapping activity, we need to ask ourselves the question, why does English, at least, have so many adjectives in the language? If I'm not mistaken, English has more adjectives than any other language. Well, why? Why do we need all these adjectives? It's because, at least in our language, we know that there are subtle differences. So you might want to call them synonyms, but they are not exact matches for one another. There is a variation in the energy it contains. There are variations in how each of these words might fit in contextually to what's going on. Like, for example, when I got my vaccine, I was certainly, maybe I was happy, satisfied. I don't know if any of these apply, but I'll tell you right now, I certainly wasn't ecstatic and elated. Those would not be what happiness I felt around doing that. Maybe I felt more tickled pink. No, not even that. Content, maybe that one's for me. But how many of you would agree that content contains a very different level of energy than walking on air?
Yes.
Yeah. And so obviously we need to take a look at these and go, if these are all different based on the situation we find ourselves in, then we know these words are all going to be positioned in different locations on the change grid. So that's where this becomes a very fun sort of, at least I find it fun, but I'm anhedonic, so who knows? It could just be me and the madness that lives between my ears. Okay, so but going back to the back one, is it possible for someone to experience happiness out-grid? And how is that happiness different than the happiness we encountered up-grid? Anybody thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would argue that the happiness out-grid comes from the alignment you feel about being on your heart line, for some people, you know, probably for most people, but for some people, that sense of power in oneself. It doesn't necessarily mean power over others, but the power in oneself that comes from not only the center of the change grid, but when you're sort of starting to move out and you're making connections with others from that place. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, because I think that outgrid is where things are accomplished. And in order to accomplish those things, others are going to be involved. As we move further and further outgrid, yeah, things can start to become a bit problematic. But without getting into the danger zone, I think that you're right. This is about the happiness of accomplishing something, whether that's making a connection, whether that's actually checking something off of your bucket list, your to-do list, or whatever. That to me feels very different than the happiness of a thrill seeker that's
Yes.
upgrade, or the happiness of escaping a near-death experience. I promise you, we've seen enough movies where they're being chased and threatened by any variety of monster, and they get away and they're very pleased with themselves, because not only are they alive, but look what they just survived. So I think that there is almost a happiness that comes from the relief you feel when you've successfully avoided, you know, a near-death experience or whatever.
So would the happiness of the pursuit, would that be
Yeah, well,
outgrid?
interestingly enough, now I think you're talking on this line between upgrid and outgrid, because if I look at the adjective map, this is where the world of romance comes into play. This is where, as Kathy was talking about, connecting with people, depending on what the level of the connection happens to be. It could be outgrid, it could be slightly upgrid. So it really, but there's still a happiness that's occurring there. Now, again, if there's happiness that is occurring upgrid and happiness that's occurring outgrid, and even happiness occurring in between, I'm starting to wonder if it's not a radial trend. And so let's see if we can take it further. Do people who are downgrid experience happiness?
I would say that that's the word you showed on that document, the content, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think there is an element of happiness there as well.
Yep. Again, what happens downgrid is this is where people become subject matter experts. This is where they become, where true creativity actually lives, is downgrid. And this is also where people might form mastery, develop all kinds of strengths around that. Might someone feel very happy on the day that they actually are acknowledged and celebrated for achieving mastery over something?
Yeah, like they won a Nobel Prize or something like that.
Yeah. Now, in the moment, if they have to make a speech, they might be upgraded, but they're upgraded about making the speech. So, you know, but to me, people who can say, I solved today's Wordle in 2 moves. Okay, well, that's very much a kind of a downgrid sort of a thing. Maybe it's a driven analytical kind of an activity, but nevertheless, it's still downgrid. And so I do believe there's a certain happiness that comes from being at peace with where you are in the moment. Again, high level of ability, low level of challenge. When you're in that situation where you have figured out how to do something, you've overcome it, there might be this happiness, but you're right, maybe that word content is more of a word we would use to describe. But I'm just about in the general vocabulary of happiness, might we find some evidence of it in people that are downgrid?
Absolutely.
I think the answer is yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so, how about in-grid? Is there a happiness that occurs in-grid? Now, remember, in-grid is very amiable, and so this is where we really put more of our attention on others, caring for others. So we're not trying to tackle great challenges, and we don't need tremendous high levels of ability. We have enough, and we have enough to be supportive, of service, those kinds of things. Do those people experience some type of happiness?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Great degree.
Yeah.
yeah. And so
It
when
probably comes from contentment and from safety.
safety, contentment,
Mhm.
yeah, I also think most people who volunteer for something show up because they're having this amiable kind of energy going on. But I can think of the things that I've just shown up for, where they go like, hey, we need volunteers, just stop by the food bank or whatever. You don't really know what they're going to ask you to do when you get there. So you don't necessarily have a whole lot of ability, but you kind of assume that it's not going to be all that challenging if they just want you to be sorting things or, putting together boxes for people or whatever the case may be. So I think a lot of volunteering lives down here. No, I don't have a whole lot of ability. It's not particularly challenging, so I think I can handle it. you know, um, I think there is a happiness that certainly comes from participating and being supportive and caring about others, etc. So just by that alone, I've just said to you that happiness exists in all four quadrants. Now, to what you guys said earlier on, the subject of that happiness or the contextual element of that happiness is certainly going to be different because I'm not a thrill seeker, I'm a volunteer. Those are two very different sets of activities, sets of circumstances. Nevertheless, there could be happiness available to me, awaiting for me in each of those kinds of quadrants. Yep.
Yeah.
So, okay, so, and I guess I'm bringing that up for a very self-serving reason. Maybe what I'm experiencing that's being categorized as endogenous depression and anhedonia, maybe inside of me, there is a certain happiness that does exist, but it's very different than the happiness that other people might be seeking or experiencing.
I
Because
was,
again, I'm
I
not
think that's true.
unhappy.
I think that's true.
Yeah, now Diane did bring up something I found very fascinating, but I don't know enough about genetics to know what this all is. But I told you that Diane had me take a gene test to find out which SSRI would end up be most effective for me. And it ended up being Pristiq, or desvenlafaxine is the generic for that. It's actually an SNRI, also affects levels of norepinephrine. Um, so anyway, she said that she wanted to take a deeper look at my genes because she has found in a certain segment of the clients that she works with that there is an anomaly on a particular gene. And as a result, the individual has fewer dopamine receptor sites than people who do not have this gene variant. And so she's pretty much convinced that I have that gene variant, but she wants to go and actually look at what my test results looked like. But part of what that brings us to is it may very well be that there is a genetic component and the degree to which you're going to experience overt happiness or how that overt happiness might be experienced. So if I said to you guys, it may very well be that if you don't have the dopamine receptor sites, maybe you're not going to have the level of drive that an outgrid person naturally has, or that driver energy naturally has. Or maybe because you don't have those dopamine receptor sites, you're not going to be as upgrid as thrill seekers might want to be. So Brian, you're a resident neuroscientist, so what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. The thing about gene is gene expression, right? Something has to trigger the gene or something inhibits the gene to act the way it needs to act. And so you talk about cell formation, you talk about all different kinds of things from diet and how that impacts how hormones are interacting. So take, for instance, though the opposite of what we're talking about, something like cancer, right? All of us have what's called oncogenes, but something triggers those oncogenes, and it's typically triggered by, or it needs glucose to survive, right?
That's right.
And so now you attribute that back to diet, and you attribute that back to lifestyle, you attribute that back to all these different kinds of factors. And I tend to think the same thing when it comes to these things that we're trying to experience: happiness, joy, satisfaction. We have baselines, and our lifestyles, choices, all these different kinds of variants, or attributes rather, become a significant part of what triggers the gene.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, again, I'm starting to really be curious to know about what my underlying biochemical or genetic situation is. Because if you guys haven't figured out by now, I use the Circle of Brilliance as my therapy. So you guys are all my therapists. But I'm very curious to just kind of know what's really going on. And maybe this understanding that happiness expresses itself or is experienced by different individuals in very different ways helps us to, how do I want to say this? Stop projecting our definitions of these words onto the population at large.
Exactly.
Now, I wanted to get back to something that is on my little outline here. So let me just scroll back a little bit. We can certainly talk about Maslow's hierarchy. I'd like to do that to see, because I'm starting to wonder if that's radial. But you know what we talked about? We look at the world around us to find out if we are four things. Are we as safe, secure, happy, and healthy as we want to be? And those four things are additive. They are not, they don't stop and the next one begins. So we say our primary focus is to be safe. Well, once we're safe, we don't set safety aside and focus on security. Now we want to be safe and secure. And once we're safe and secure, we don't drop those and focus on happiness. Now we want to be safe, secure, and happy. And then ultimately, we want to add that one of health to what's really going on. So if I said, I wonder if those plot into concentric circles that overlay on the change grid, would that hold true? Would that hold true? And I don't know that the answer is there, but if that is the case, I would say to you that happiness can't go top to bottom, right to left, edge to edge. That really can't be reality, because is someone in an outgrid, upgrid, downgrid, or ingrid danger zone? Is this where there's even a possibility of happiness other than someone who has a true underlying pathological, I don't even know what DSM diagnosis they would have, because they could be delusional and think that what they're happy, but we're trying to be thinking about otherwise normally functioning people. Yeah, I'm sure masochists are happy, sadists are happy, but a DSM would not put them into the range of normal mental health. So yeah, are you guys with me on my little puzzle question? Yes. I mean, again, you're the gifted people, so I kind of feel like this is something that none of us would ever teach in a classroom setting, but this is interesting stuff. And so let me throw the dark side of the change grid up on the screen for just a second. So I can zoom in a little bit on this, that might help. But what's important to know is that these are where the four danger zones meet on the dark side of the change sphere, I guess it would have to be in this depiction. So these are the outgrid danger zone adjectives right here. So arrogant, bossy, dominating, forcible, manipulative. The upgrid danger zone adjectives included things like forgetful and reactive and haphazard, doomed, frozen, imperiled, terrified. On the ingrid side of things, avoiding, cowardly, fragile, pallid, passive, shy. oppressed, etc. And downgrid, aloof, remote, moody, negative, lackluster. I don't think any of these words are going to be found on any of the thesaurus's sheets on words associated with happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But these people in their delusion, the one adjective that everyone shares at the true powerless point is delusional. So maybe, just maybe, these brutal, autocratic, domineering, intolerant, warmongering, wicked people derive some sense of pleasure from carrying themselves forceful, relentless, manipulative. Maybe they get off on that. But we would certainly say that these are unhealthy behaviors, unhealthy mindset. Are we in agreement on that, or
Yeah.
anybody want to help people become more argumentative or more stubborn, more intolerant, more warmongering?
I think we have enough of that going around.
Yeah, and we see how that all turns out. So, so they
You mean
may
litigation professors.
well, yeah, but even then, we think that what they're trying to do is to win a case that they believe has merit. So I don't know, maybe there's some other that just want to win so they can say, I've never lost a case. Something like that, which means they're probably choosing things from some very, I want to say, pathological sort of place. You know, they only take on cases they believe they can win. Maybe that just makes you a good lawyer. I really don't know. Okay, but I can go all the way around this and I just say maybe, just maybe, people would be deluded into thinking this is some variation on happiness, but yeah, this is the masochist, or this is the masochist, this is the sadist. Okay, anyway, so I brought this up just to say that if we're going to be looking at radial trends, we have to know that this far out grid, this far up grid, that's not where happiness continues to exist. So at a certain point, that happiness is replaced by delusion. Yeah, I don't know.
So by radial trend, you mean starting at the center and work its way outward?
Yeah, so if I use, I'll use
outside?
this diagram instead. So you know how we've talked about that at the center of the change grid is where we find that perfect harmony, balance. This is where the art of caring detachment can occur. We can separate ourselves from what's going on. I may say to you that that is also a form of happiness, but we have an opportunity to go beyond happiness, above happiness. So happiness at its highest expression might be self-actualization in Maslow's terms, might be joy. Because joy is, as Kathy was describing it, more of, is it more of an elevated state of awareness?
I would argue that that's where joy lives in the change.
That's where
Yeah.
joy lives. So are people that are joyful also happy? Probably, but they would consider to be happiness to be like a starting point they were at long ago in their pursuit and achievement of joy. So I'm thinking that if there is a place where joy lives, as I move away from that joyful and joyous place, I'm still could very well be happy inside of this green circle. I don't know how far that radius that encompasses happiness might extend. Maybe some of those other words are found here. And then we get happiness is what's going on between the green and the red kind of circle. Although, you know, that's something we'd actually want to explore about what's going on. But I believe there's a place where happiness ends, and there's a place where happiness evolves into other things. And if we did that, then we could say, well, what are Maslow's, my goodness, what are Maslow's hierarchy of needs? We start off with, what's at the base?
It.
What? What?
Isn't it
Food, water, food,
yeah.
clothing, shelter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Food, water, shelter.
Yeah, food, water, shelter. These are things that are about safety first and then security.
Right.
So safety and security. After I've got the safety and security in place, what does Maslow think I move on to next? Do we need to review Maslow's hierarchy
I
of
forget
needs?
his stuff for so long.
All
Someone,
right.
in fact, one of his students just wrote a book on that and talked about moving beyond that. Is
Yeah,
self-actualization the top one or something?
self-actualization is Maslow's highest.
Right.
But
And
I
he
think
talked
if we try to
self-actualization.
move, if we try to integrate Maslow with what we were talking about as far as spiral dynamics goes,
Mm-hmm.
it may very well be that we're seeing a whole society move, well, not the whole society, obviously, but a good portion of the society, of the civilization, moving closer and closer to self-actualization, which is what's making these lower spiral behaviors look even more heinous than they did before. So, this is why our tolerance for certain behaviors that we are witnessing in certain locations around the planet is even more repugnant to us than it was before. And now we can no longer say that there is any time where war is justified, or we understand. No, I think there's a part of the evolution of that spiral dynamic where people kind of go like, nah. Even borders, you start to wonder what is the actual value of borders. I understand there's impractical things that would need to be addressed if we were going to eliminate a world with borders, world's borders. But nevertheless, you get the idea. I'm just thinking like maybe that's also what's happening. So what I'd like to do on Thursday's call is see if we can take a look at Maslow's actual hierarchy and see where that applies. And then I did find several hierarchies of happiness, and I'd like to pull one of those out and see how it might overlay. And by the way, as we're doing this, what we're really doing is the job of adjective mapping. And so I want to review with you guys, what does the adjective mapping process really involved? So adjective mapping is, to me, the highest level of what I want to say, of participation in all that is tension management. So that is, for me, the most gifted of the gifted people involved in those conversations, those debates about where do these adjectives reside. So hopefully you guys find it. It's also the most tedious thing that you do in the world of adjective mapping, or in the world of tension management. But I think that's a really interesting thing to take a look at. Okay, so with that, I'll thank you all very much for joining in, and we'll pick up where we left off come Thursday. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Bye for now. Bye.